So this morning's first panel is on securing giant leaps in space exploration. You heard from the last speaker that Purdue University is the #1 non-military organization for producing astronauts. So I think it's very fitting that we're exploring this today. I even wore my space tie today, if you notice. It's keeping with the theme, so we're going well. We've got another, I think, outstanding panel today set up for us. The moderator is known to anybody that's worked in this field before, Professor Dan De Laurentiis. He's the director for the Institute of Global Security and Defense Innovation and a professor of aeronautics and astronautics here at Purdue University. He's got a long list of accomplishments behind him, and I know that he's been sort of the go-to guy in everything astro-aero here on this campus. So rather than dwelling on that, I'm just going to go straight to the panel. I'll let Dan introduce his colleagues on the panel, and we'll take it from there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jerry. How's my microphone working? Good? All right. Well, welcome, everyone, and it is a great opportunity for me to be chairing this panel. What I've found in my faculty career over the years is that I've gotten better and better at asking questions rather than answering them sometimes, and so I have the pleasure of putting a little context out there for the panel and then asking some questions of our panelists to get things going, but certainly want to get vigorous participation from all of you in the audience. So speaking of cradle of astronauts, you know, my childhood dream was to be an astronaut. I was, besides being so fascinated by space, I know my colleague here and I share a lot of this background. Besides being fascinated by space from really as early as I can remember, it was one of the only careers in which my height was optimized for that occupation. So that was good. And so actually I, just a little background and context here, I went to the Florida Institute of Technology. I want to give a shout out to FIT in Melbourne, Florida for my undergraduate program, because I was convinced that the only way I could become an astronaut was to go to the university that was closest to the Kennedy Space Center. So that showed you sometimes my narrow thinking, not realizing that for a Chicago kid, down the road here in West Lafayette, Indiana, was this wonderful place called Purdue. Life and serendipity did bring me back here, and it's been a fabulous journey for me here in Purdue Aero Astro Department. The wonderful heritage, but also I think the wonderful forward-looking aspects that we have for space exploration and everything about space. Obviously, you all know from the format of the panels here at the symposium that we're celebrating our 150th anniversary here at Purdue. We're celebrating the 50th anniversary of Apollo and probably X number of other anniversaries that I'm missing. But certainly the heritage in space exploration at Purdue, beyond not just our Aero Astro department, some of those wonderful astronauts that we've had and some of the innovators that we've generated from Purdue come from varied departments. And so that's another testament, I think, to Purdue's role in this space. But we also, I think, because of this great history, we have always to make sure that we're not focusing too much on our history, but we're also focusing on the future. And so anniversaries are those kind of double-edged swords, if you will, or opportunities is a better word, for us to also look ahead. And so thinking about 50 years in the future, while the title of this panel is on space exploration, I think it's fair to say that all the evidence shows that the next 50 years is likely to be what really people thought we were going to get to 50 years ago after the great Apollo successes, and that is not just sending astronauts into various places in cislunar space, but actually as a society, as humanity, becoming a species that lives and works outside, off of the Earth. So that's the lens I would like to use for thinking about this panel and for the discussion we're going to have, ranging from commerce in space, commerce on Earth that's generated from space, using resources in space to enhance life on Earth, and then again, ultimately, finding a way for us to have a regular presence for humanity off of this planet. And when you think about it with that lens, at least the way I think about it, and when I think about that lens, we have to do all the things that we do with every other aspect of our civilization here on Earth. And that is have robust infrastructure, have economic and policy constructs that make things work, or at least work as well as possible. And part of that, of course, is making sure things are secured in a manner that's appropriate, while also being flexible to responding to new opportunities, new demand signals from the market, and all of those things that we care about to have a vibrant societal asset in terms of a new place to do things that we love to do as humans. So that's the very broad lens that I'd like us to think about in terms of space exploration. And I think we have a panel here that comes from, each of them come from a distinctly, I would say, different background, which is exactly the point of why we formed this panel. And so what I'd like to do is briefly introduce them. Really, you have, I think, bios in the packet, but I want to just say a few words about them. And then I'm going to follow that with an initial prompting question that will be broad enough to generate, I think, a lot of reaction from the panel. And then we'll move on from there and certainly hope to get the audience participation as well. So, sitting on my left is Professor Barrett Caldwell, Professor of Industrial Engineering, and again, one of my closest colleagues here ever since I joined Purdue. And we've worked on several projects together, Barrett, as you know, in the space exploration area. And so again, I think you can see from Barrett's background, he brings a really amazing perspective, in my humble opinion, in terms of the human factors part of these new activities that we're going to do in this big vision for space, but also I think a critical look on how information sharing and information processing plays a role in that. And so I think what you'll find from Barrett is very much of a stimulating set of ideas that are going to cause us to think sometimes less about the physical things that we'll be doing stuff in space, but in many ways the interactions between them. At least that's my hope. Dalin Chu is Deputy for Technology Programs at Sandia National Labs. I had the opportunity to meet Dalin very recently in person at Sandia, and I just know from that short interaction that he has sort of a deep background in areas that relate to national security in terms of the assets that we have in space, especially some of the electronic and related components of any of the systems that we're going to be using in fielding. But I think his research background and his research leadership at Sandia really is going to be a great value add to the conversation here because of some of the issues that he knows are out there, but some of the mitigations that are on the horizon as well. Next, I believe, is Carolyn Ferb, my colleague in Aero-Astro. She's an assistant professor and in our department and focusing on many different sort of technology areas in and around space situational awareness and our ability to fuse information, to protect assets and to understand where assets are, etc. So again, think about space traffic management, just like air traffic management will be a critical infrastructure and a critical activity that we're going to have to accomplish. Among many other reasons, I'm wonderfully happy to have Carolyn as a colleague. Just before this, I saw her in the back of the room and I said, Carolyn, are you ready to be smart and quippy? And she said, aren't I always? So my point was proved. So Carolyn, welcome. And finally, Cliff Macklin, who I'm very excited about having on our panel because among all of our panelists, Cliff is someone I haven't met yet, so I'm looking forward to a wonderful set of new ideas from a colleague that I think is going to be able to share a lot for us. As you can see from the bio, Cliff is an engineering fellow at Raytheon. As any of you know from these large companies that have thousands and thousands of employees, becoming an engineering fellow means that you are one of the very select few within the company that have produced a distinguished record. And really, beyond the record, it's a person that the company relies on for new ideas and charting a course in the future. So I'm sure Cliff will be sharing some of those ideas with us. So with that introduction of the panel, here is the first question I would like to put on the table. And that is, in short, in this wonderful world that we will be entering in for many activities in space, what could go wrong? Let's start with the depressing part, and then we'll come back around to what are some great ideas for making it right. Professor Caldwell.
Thanks for starting with that softball. So when we were talking during the break, Professor Viewers, I'm just going to call
Just call me.
said, can you come up with 3 words? And I thought, oh my goodness. And then, because I knew that I was going to be backed up, I'm not going to talk about shooting at things. I'm not going to talk about sticking flash drives into computers or any of that stuff. My 3 words are unresolved stack overflow. We just had a GPS time clock rollover that not everybody got the memo, literally. And so there are people who are not appropriately reading their GPS signals. That's a bad day. I mean, we go back 50 years, and we've got our man Neil flying around, trying to land, and we've got alarms. They're data alarms. Fortunately, it's a really good pilot flying a really robust machine with a few extra gallons in the tank. And so that stack overflow got managed. What happens if we've got a sysloaner program where people are not in continuous comms? Worse yet, if we are 2/3 of the way to Mars, or 62 sols into a Mars exploration, you have a space-forward architecture so that most of the problem resolution gets solved by the crew and by the onboard intelligent agents. If they have a stack overflow, they have to start thinking about which data do I support, and ground won't help. That's a very bad.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah, so I would say, again, you try and foresee the unforeseen, but again, in a $1 billion payload, okay, satellite payload, you're dealing with latent hardware component failures that are just, despite your best efforts for qualification and screening, you're dealing with a very harsh environment. So some of these are detectable and through qualification, but many times actually you're dealing with just small quantities of components, right? And we all know how Intel and the semiconductor business works is it's massive volumes. But when you're dealing with very small quantities, you're dealing with components that could possibly fail, and they have failed. So certainly that's a major concern, okay? And your customers don't like hearing, something's not working. And again, at Sandia, we try and figure out ways to fix that. Likewise, I would say flight software. Again, despite your best efforts to make sure that your flight software, you've exercised various different scenarios. Again, things happen, right? To the extent that you gets locked in a particular mode where you no longer can point your telescope at a particular area of interest, to the extent that, again, you do your best to do ample testing, but things go, Murphy's Law, things go wrong.
Okay, so I thought when I first heard Dan asking the question, I thought one thing we have to realize that space is a different domain than what we are used on Earth. For one, autonomy is not a choice, okay? So we are relying on highly autonomous systems. Sometimes in the percentage, we have onboard astronauts, and they can do a few things, but they are extremely limited. So we are relying on an autonomous system, and in order to run that, we have to communicate with it. Okay, it's not a choice. My mission is not going to be successful if I just send it up and never communicate with it. That's our definition of space debris at that point. So we have to keep a communication channel open, and that automatically makes the system vulnerable. Okay, as we know. So as because we are so far away from these things, scenarios as, for example, software updates are very different. It was maybe the first time we had a similar scenario on Earth when we were talking about the Nike shoe failure, right? Those self-tying shoes. There was a software update to start them, and that destroyed your, I don't know, $300 sneaker. And that was a big shock for people here, but that is kind of the dimension of economic failure that you have. This is not an unknown failure in space, that you change the software, you have to update something, and then there's no way of recovering it. And that then leads to physical failure of your system, to the death of your satellite, similar to the Nike shoes. That is not as rare scenario as we have it here on Earth, but a more common scenario. The other thing we have to keep in mind is what we already heard, kind of the physical environment. It also means we are operating boxes or kind of computer towers flying around with several kilometers per second. Okay, so we have kind of bullet speed. That means if something goes wrong, something breaks off, it's going to damage us. If we maneuver into something else, it's going to damage us. If we want to land on Mars and we have the velocity wrong, we're just going to crash into the surface. So in that sense, failures are have much higher repercussions than we are used to. And economic failure has a much higher impact than what we're used to, where we can still kind of plug in the USB cable and try to save it if an update goes wrong.
All right, so what could go wrong? So as an engineer, I've been working on systems for a long time, developing new systems and things like that. And my saying is always usually, nothing works unless you make it work. Everything comes broken, right? Nothing just starts to work, right? So if you say nothing, what can go wrong? The first question I would ask is similar to what he was discussing earlier with the green and red slide. Seems like everyone paid attention to that slide. So those first two steps being super critical. So my background, again, is embedded systems a lot and cybersecurity in terms of getting cybersecurity and weapon systems and things like that. The first step is understanding what are you expecting to get right? And I think that's, just to reiterate what was talked about earlier, is that's the critical step, is to understand if you're, what kind of risk are you willing to take? On a lot of the contract work that I do, you'd like to believe that cybersecurity on some of our systems is going to be like you're going to spend billions of dollars. It is the government after all, so they'll be willing to spend billions of dollars on everything, and that's not the case, right? These contracts are very cost and schedule sensitive, and cybersecurity very often at this point, is a unwelcome guest very often, right? When you're trying to put a radar in a plane, the idea is that it finds targets and it helps you maneuver and so on and so forth. The idea isn't that I have a function on there that detects an intruder, and that's not really the focus of what that product is for. So again, it comes down to, when I look at that, even in space, whatever those systems might be, what is your risk appetite, and what are you trying to accomplish? Some of the things when you look at space from a cybersecurity perspective, and you start talking about, putting people on another planet and things like that, and interacting. One of the things that we take advantage of, obviously, in everyday life, and that we're used to, is the paradigm of being able to authenticate when I can reach out and touch that person, right? That physicality is a huge way of how we make sure things are real, right? Everybody's heard the red pill, blue pill. Well, if you have a whole society somewhere else, and all your connection is through this network of technology and so on, the possibilities of what could go wrong seem to be almost endless when you start talking about the motivations relative to financial, never mind the loss of life and what's going on. You talk about with the elections and the undercutting confidence. You can imagine the impacts of attacking a system like that when you talk about the magnitude of investment, as well as the national pride and all the other things that are wrapped around that. So if we're talking about what can go wrong, I'd really say, okay, what are we expecting to get first, right?
So actually, I'd like to build on that, Cliff, and it really has been kind of a natural flow here. So speaking of sort of understanding, what could go wrong and what's expected to go right, thinking back first to the Apollo program. How many of you have seen this interesting, really fascinating feature out right now called Apollo 11? It's in the movie theaters. Anyone? Anyone? Okay. No, not many. I strongly recommend it. I took my 6-year-old son to it, and I think we were both equally fascinated. And popcorn helped one of us stay focused on that. But it is not. I wanted to find the right word. Have you seen it? Okay. It's not a dramatization. It's not a Hollywood flick. It's basically an hour-and-a-half long compilation of real footage from the mission, from the capsule and what the astronauts were doing, and prior to launch, how they were getting ready. Their only really sort of voiceover is Walter Cronkite, but that's his actual voiceover from the time things were being prepared for the launch of the mission. So really fascinating, and just time after time, every critical function, every critical part was actually going as expected. Now, we know later Apollo programs had something different, but even though they were going into a relatively unknown environment, of course, we were at the moon before Apollo 11, right? We just didn't land on it. There was a very well-defined, I think, and a lot of engineers and a lot of people contributed to that. One of the reasons, actually, as an aside, we're so proud of Neil Armstrong as a Purdue alum is that, as you saw from when he returned from the mission and the rest of his life, he always deflected the praise to the people, not only his fellow crewmates, but the people on the ground, the thousands of people in Houston and everywhere else in the corporate community that contributed. Anyway, so everything went well. So take that, and building on Cliff's comment about how do we deal with these unimagined possibilities. So now let me imagine 30 years from now, we have a permanent commercial presence on the moon. I want you all to visualize this because you're going to have to react to it here shortly. We have multiple corporations and some government operations taking place on the moon. There's a mining operation that's the core of this vibrant commercial activity. And there's a vibrant set of hotels in cislunar space that are transiting people. There's tourists, there's workers coming to the surface. Billions and billions of dollars are being made, and prosperous things are happening. And then all of a sudden, on a sunny side of the moon, Monday morning, they discover a strange black object with the dimensions of 1 by 4 by 9. I expected more laughter.
I get it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so. And shortly after that, it really didn't get reported anywhere, but shortly after that, all of the critical communications between that presence on the moon and the Earth, many of the operations and even the economic transaction stuff, all go haywire. And there are multiple countries operating also on the lunar surface at this time. And so how would you, Barrett, go about figuring out what went wrong?
You owe me a beer after that. Well, I think, ow. Okay, so one of the first issues that I would say is that everyone on this lunar enterprise zone, if you will, had been issued as part of their standard deployment pack a copy of Heinlein's The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. And one of the reasons is that, actually, it's not that far off from one of the scenarios that's being played out in Heinlein's book. And this is obviously a few years before Kubrick took his shot. The people who are up there will start out with representation and alignment with the corporation or the nation that they started with. They will evolve fairly quickly into a different orientation to being, whatever phrase they use, lunatic comes to mind, to say, we're in this together and no one down there is going to help us as much as us up here, even if you're from a competing country, even if you're from a competing corporation, especially if you then tell us that we are not going to get any more edicts or insights or recommendations from the Home Office as long as this obelisk is here. They are going to have to figure out how they're going to work together, how they're going to do local comm, local interactions. I don't know, putting together regolith for little standing stone signals. But they're going to have to work together, and they're going to have that sense of a local culture that transcends wherever they came from, specifically to deal with these sorts of interruptions.
I like it.
You still owe me.
Adaptive culture.
Well, I guess again, with a kind of more of a nefarious mind, one would want to make sure that all communications of all countries are knocked out, and it wasn't maybe a suspicious implant by an adversary. So again, you're dealing certainly with any number of possibilities. Could have been an EMP event that could have knocked out all the electronics. So again, provided, let's say, you get the benefit of the doubt that it was something of an alien nature, certainly there would be an alliance formed, and we certainly would want to interrogate it and make sure that if it's giving off certain emissions that disabled all the, capabilities abroad. Yeah, I would agree. We would take a unified front to certainly understand and figure out what could be done, and maybe perhaps communicate with it to the extent of maybe scenes out of, the movies.
Any thoughts from the latter end of the table?
Yeah, I mean, you put out these scenarios, and now I have to kind of play the spoil sport here. But I mean, so for one, I think we do not have to kid ourselves. Even in that scenario, you're not self-sufficient on the moon at that point. So you're looking, if communication and transportation of goods cannot be established in that scenario, we're looking at death of the community on the moon. I would go briefly into kind of a philosophical viewpoint here. I would say no alliance is formed, but more with Thomas Hobbes, that life is brutish and short, and that kind of the strongest ones will survive. I think there will be a very nasty time on the moon where weaker parts are suppressed, and
Hunger Games.
Yeah, it's got some kind of more tech-savvy small alliance of a handful of people will kind of rule, and then trying to solve it on the technical level, and maybe then the most or the best equipped ones from their home country will take out the other ones, because they're just useless eaters at this point. So I have a bit more kind of negative view on that. When we want to tie it to kind of nowadays, we are looking into making further moon missions as it looks at the moment, and maybe it's worthwhile to make a comparison to kind of the Apollo missions. I mean, from the computational standpoint, I mean, we have, even on the old phones, which were not smartphones, we had kind of similar computation power than what we put on the Apollo mission. Okay, so that means the computation that we did and the software that we employed were very different. Okay, and that was also the time where we still did computing on the cards and these things, if some of you remember. Okay, when we're doing missions now, it will be very different, and I think it will also make us more vulnerable. Okay, we can do more things. We can do that much better, in a sense, but we also see we make new mistakes. If we're looking at the Boeing Max at the moment, I mean, that was a way of giving more autonomy to the system. And we can do that because we have better computational power, but then we are leading also into new failures that the Apollo mission could not have, in that sense, because the computation were on such a lower level at that point. We're also going to do that not with one big spaceship, but most likely we will do that with kind of a swarm of smaller satellites, kind of one bigger part carrying the astronauts and then swarming satellites which are supporting. That's a much better way of doing it. If it works properly, it's more robust. However, it also makes it a lot more vulnerable. Okay? Any communication, I mean, I have wireless communication between the parts of the satellites. That means that also communication I can kind of tap into. A small satellite has very limited capabilities. Okay? Makes it also harder to put on more security. Okay? On the other hand, I have a cube in space. Maybe it can maneuver a little bit. It has a large velocity, so I can still use it kind of as a physical impactor if I want to just do damage to it. So I think thinking about the old Apollo days is good, but we're in a much different place nowadays.
So what you said, this thing shows up, there's no communication, and what do I do now, right? So this is the kind of conversation that that you would have before you've actually put people on the moon, hopefully, right? So this would be the state of trying to figure out what you need to go right, right? So if we were having, hopefully this conversation, if it just happened once, you're already up there. I will send everyone else first, right? If this is the approach. But if you've had this conversation already, it really comes down. It's really similar to what I consider, just regular architecture when you're dealing with CPUs and things like that. You lose communication, but in and of itself, that's information for people on Earth. So you have an idea of a protocol between. I would expect that having had this conversation a priori, right? That you'd have the idea of a protocol, right? You'd have to know if you're not going to be self-sufficient with a certain particular population, you limit the population size based on what the resources are. You'd have a projection of how many days you can actually survive, and your protocol would have 15 layers of redundancy. In other words, I'm sending things up there or physically making that connection within a quarter of that time if something goes wrong, right? So I think it really, if your original question was how do you debug the kind of why'd you lose communication? Probably in that kind of disaster recovery situation, there's probably another protocol of survival first, and then figuring out later, just reestablishing communication regardless if I have a bunch of junk flying in the air that I was supposed to be using to communicate, reestablishing that communication, right? So I think this is it's the perfect question to ask beforehand, and it's often when I work with customers sometimes and they come in because cybersecurity is obviously something that people can't easily measure often. It really comes down to what you expect to happen correctly and the risk that you're willing to take. It's exactly that question that I'll have with them about, well, this is your architecture and this is how you think the system's going to run, and they haven't asked questions like that a priori sometimes. And you go and they tell you how it's going to work. You say, well, then you're okay with this happening. Well, no, of course not. I'm not okay with that happening. If all the communication comes out and everybody dies in a week, I'm not happy with that. Well, that's what your architecture has right now built into it. I mean, it's just you're not trying to architect for this specific scenario. So it is a good place to start, even from when you're looking at cybersecurity and you're trying to help somebody with their system, and you ask them what people don't know about least privilege, access, protecting access, and all these defense in depth, and all these are basically a different language to a lot of people who don't deal with cybersecurity. But that kind of question right there, when you go, they know what they want to protect, though. They know what bad behavior looks like, and if you pose it that way, very often, okay, you have this information. And it may go away for 3 days because of X, Y, Z, or you may lose this capability completely when this goes out. You're okay with that, that's all right. And then that conversation starts talking about building that protocol and building the systems and responses at the detailed level and at the CPU ASIC level in terms of what you're doing from a system standpoint, all the way up to the strategy for the overall system, right? So hopefully there's a plan before you get there.
So as I'm listening, I do want to add one more piece. And Caroline, I actually now understand how dark can be. And I'll ask you again the next time I need that. But no, there's a really serious issue here about what do we do, and do we try to solve the problem? Do we try to detect and isolate and recover the problem according to our standard mechanisms, or do a bunch of people go out and kick dirt until it says, okay, land food here in the dust? And you can still have a telescope that sees that. And so when we think about what is our response should be to set up robust alternatives, not just to dig down into whatever we had before.
Well, I have one quick follow-up, but I'd like the audience to be prepared if you're not prepared already, because after that, a few quick comments on that, I would like those of you in the audience that have some questions to take this conversation forward to come up to the microphone. So briefly picking up, I think, we kind of documented there's a lot that could go wrong. I think the word infinite was used, and that's probably the case. But then Cliff and Barrett just started talking about what are we going to do about it. Be prepared, look at your architecture, and I think what you were trying to say is also there's the robustness to the scenarios you haven't thought of, right, Barrett? Anything else the panel wants to share? I'd like to add one more point on what to do about it, and that is, I think this future in space will be one in which no single entity owns all the assets. And so a strict sort of command and control and operations model, is probably not going to be present. So with that lens, any thoughts on what we can do better in terms of mitigations and adaptations? Dallin or Carolyn, if you'd like to start, since Cliff and...
So I think if as we're going to the smaller architectures with a number of CubeSats or small sats, I mean, one thing is to be prepared and then say, okay, what happens if 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of those die on me? And then, okay, can I have a reconfigurable network on that? Can it do that autonomously without kind of risky software update that I have to do from the ground that could potentially go wrong? So that we are more configurable. Then refurbishing in space is becoming an issue. It's kind of hard on the physical side, but kind of on the software side, it's okay. If something dies on that, can we reuse it in the best possible way? And I think there's planning ahead and having the flexibility in mind that we need, because things will go wrong.
Yeah, and I would, further add, I mean, you build in a lot of redundancy in your systems. I mean, obviously, you're dealing also with a harsh radiation environment. So, redundancy helps, but probably you would also be interested in, collecting data analytics. What are the symptoms of the other, counterpart systems to arrive at whether it might be specific to, the nature of the architecture or some other parameter with respect to doing diagnostics. And again, if the failure modes are all common, then you've got a serious problem, maybe of alien nature. So.
Well, all right. Why don't we have some audience participation? So anyone want to start off some of the reactions or questions? They could be I'm sure the panelists would field anything from technology questions to philosophy questions to science fiction questions. Go ahead. Are we passing microphones, Jerry?
There's one in the middle.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, thanks for a very interesting discussion of this space domain. So the problems that you are defining are fairly generic, highly robust. It has to be robust. It has to be, highly autonomous, reconfigurable. But these are generic problems. So what would be a research agenda? Let's say I want to start a new research program. Can you articulate a few fundamental problems that are specific to space in this area?
I can start.
Yeah, thanks.
We don't know how to launch mission control. Right now, every CSERT, every response team, every group we have is very human heavy. We don't know how to create intelligent agents that are effective teammates. with a small number of humans. That we can split out some of the function allocation, but we are not having a fight over control. So one of the questions is, if I've got, and actually I'm thinking about this right now for some projects, how in the world am I going to get agents that know how to communicate with the crew in reducing a whole bunch of data and turning it into effective teammate information? And it's really hard to go. It's really hard to stay on Mars if we don't have that capability, because you cannot rely on the ground to save you at 12 light minutes one way.
Thank you. Yeah.
So when you say, what are some research areas? I mean, we've talked about some kind of generic problems too, right? So one of the things I would be asking first, is what is the specific problem that you're trying to deal with, right? So if we specifically talked about the communications issue, right, in terms of the availability of communications, and then there's the other aspect that he brought up about that being working for the aerospace and defense, the idea of sharing. Sharing isn't as comfortable for me as far as infrastructure and things like that in space. So if you had tackled, for example, the sharing of infrastructure in space, how do you, given a particular functionality that you support, assuming it's not national security related, as far as detecting missiles and these kind of things, intelligence and those kind of things, how do you share infrastructure in a trustworthy manner, and what are the aspects of how you go about doing that? I think there's some very positive things about it, because obviously, as far as this example that we flew out from a communication standpoint, and I think someone else had mentioned, there's a vested interest in everybody making sure it still works, but there's also the aspect of it being available to everybody as well, and you've got code from possibly multiple different places that are at different levels of trust and things like that. So how do you create an infrastructure that is shared, but at the same time trusted to provide the service that you're expecting out of it? I think would be a bit of a challenge.
And this is specific to space. This problem.
Well, I'm saying specifically the reason why I think space is a big deal is, like I said, I think one of the things that you do in networks a lot, right, is for authenticity. Well, there's two aspects of this for this particular thing. I do not deal with systems. We don't see a lot of systems that are mission critical. Like this is mission critical in some fashion, right? That as far as the defense and aerospace, where we share. Even if we do share, there's other ways if that doesn't work, right? Generally, right? So if you were going to actually be in a situation where you're sharing and it's mission critical, there's a high level of trust that's going to be required, and that's hard to achieve in a situation where you don't control all the aspects of that individual, that piece, right? So that's how that works, how you make that work exactly, I think would be a pretty hard problem, right? So, and space, I think, adds some new challenges to that. One of the things is, having out-of-band like certificate authorities and things like that to do authentication, all these kind of things. It's easy to say, well, I got to fall back of the physical aspect of getting things to where I need them to be. But because everything is not, you don't have that physical aspect, and you've got this other party sitting on your machine that can now subvert maybe the functionality and things like that. It's a different problem, right? So, for example, if you think of like Spectre and Meltdown, right? Spectre and Meltdown are issues because people can, running code on the system can do things to the system to take advantage of the shared resources on that particular system, and not the system itself, but the processor itself, right? In this type of environment, you could very easily see having code of multiple people, and now that particular vulnerability becomes more relevant than if only my code can run on that system, right? So these are the kind of things that there's a lot of problems, I think, to solve with shared infrastructure, especially if it's mission critical.
Yeah, and I was just going to add also, I think to do it in a cost-effective and insertion ease standpoint, I mean, right, cost and time in terms of, designers wanting to incorporate that, because I mean, the whole thing about trusted systems is there's an insertion cost, right? And the bottom line is that you've got schedule and these billion-dollar programs that again, exceedingly just have extreme pressures. So again, we look at our commercial counterparts, right, SpaceX and so forth, how they've been able to expediently deploy their systems. So I think there's a lot that government can learn probably from how the commercial side is getting more in the business. On the other hand, I think there's a lot of government regulations imposed on safety, and I'm not saying that commercial entities don't have to do that. I'm just saying they don't have as much of the red tape and bureaucracy. And I think, again, elements of automation in terms of flight mission planning, because, again, these take months to years versus incorporating more autonomy to have things that could be done in a quicker time frame, because, again, it boils down to cost and money.
Thanks.
Yeah, I would just add on to it. Yeah, I mean, eliminating the human in the loop, thinking about inter-satellite communication. We cannot just have a Wi-Fi and communicate over that. So that's space-specific. What are ways of communication that work under those extreme constraints of computational power? You have a very small processor. For the navigation solution, you have 4 milliseconds to do that, to figure out where you are, where you're looking. So those are specific constraints, small batteries, what communication works, how can we have higher autonomy on that, as was mentioned before. Another space-specific problem that also relates to the moon is how can we have external information on it if we are losing communication? How can we have telescope, radar, or other systems that allow to passively kind of figure out things about the satellite so that we know, okay, in which direction is the antenna pointing, so that we can re-establish communication. As we are so far away, that's different from other systems that we know.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Just like to say, wonderful presentation. I love the 2001 references. That's excellent. Enjoyable, but terrifying. Mr. Macklin, talking about in regards to cybersecurity applications on, say, theoretical human mission to Mars, back and forth. You're not so worried about someone sniffing your ports, breaking in, stealing your stuff. You're 4 light minutes from Earth. It's not going to happen. But how would you go about designing a system architecture that's designed less to protect from outside influences and more to protect the system from itself, while presenting a way for highly trained lay people who aren't necessarily cybersecurity experts to correct system errors when it goes about? Basically a self-correcting, different tools for self-correcting problems within the system, so a catastrophic meltdown doesn't happen and everybody dies.
Right. So, so as far as, there's a lot of issues. I understand the idea of, you're saying for sniffing ports and things like that for entry, right? But, so you're worried about integrity is huge, right? For what you're worried about there. So how do you keep it up and running and not have a cybersecurity expert sitting on board analyzing everything as you go? I think is kind of what you're saying, just reiterating? Okay. So I think from an architectural standpoint, you're talking about trying to build in a kind of aided resilience kind of thing, right? So it's not like it's completely autonomously going to continue to run on its own and monitor everything and be able to self-heal and move forward. You're saying just with some help. So I think the keys in that kind of environment is, first of all, from an architectural standpoint, you want to be able to create some slop, is what I would call it, relative to your ability to fix things. So you're definitely going to have to deal with some level of redundancy and things like that anyway. The challenge with redundancy, right, is that if people tend to use it, right, and you fail over, but the problem is then what happens when you fail again, and then you can't fail back over, right? So reconstitution and things like that are important, right? So Right. At some point, you're running out, right? And there are, like, say, size, weight, and power concerns and things like that. You can't make this thing a bus, right? So in terms of the amount of stuff that you drop on it. So obviously, what you need is You could say you have tools and things like that. My approach probably wouldn't be this, but I'll tell you what I would probably think you'd want to do. But you could probably have like things like tools and things like that to do analysis that obviously would have to take this information and make it actionable to do reconstitution. I think if you have laymen and things like that, you're probably going to break things more than you're going to fix things. And you don't need people trying to think too deeply when they're in those environments. So in most, or as little as possible, right? There's enough to worry about as it is. So I would probably take the approach as some level of redundancy, probably more than one, depending on where you got for size, weight, power, and your requirements and so on. And then reconstitution would be a start over type of approach. And the tools that I would probably say you'd want are the kind of tools that kind of rebuild you from a known state versus trying to analyze and figure out and things like that. If you assume that the environment is one where you're not actively being attacked because you say, well, you're too far away and things like that, if that's the threat model you're working with, one of the challenges might be that if you're running into things that if you don't have an inherent problem in what you've developed, then you might have a supply chain problem, which could be something you can't really subvert. At that point, you might just be in bad shape. You're just trying to keep it limping along until you get somewhere. But
again, thank you all for presenting today. It's very interesting. Thousands of years ago, I worked on SETI, and what we were worried about was being spoofed on Earth. Crop dusting. I mean, not crop dusting. Circles in the fields, and the electronic equivalent of that is somebody spoofing us and making us think we were getting readings that weren't really coming from out there. But having said that, I would urge you also to think about. I haven't heard people talk about software, and I don't see any breathtaking breakthroughs in software yet these days. And formal methods will kill you if you try to do it for something, unless it's the absolute smallest, most critical code you have. And so I would urge you also to think about folks from the reliability world and what they're saying in this venue as well. And the other ideas about supporting autonomy of the individuals in space. It's a lot similar to medicine and supporting a physician with information about how to make. They typically have just a set of symptoms, but they need a lot more support for more complex decisions. And so I really think the idea of supporting the autonomy of those individuals there with AI and other kinds of things is really crucial. But my main point was about the software. NASA's done tremendous work in this area, but it's still a tremendous amount of code that's unverifiable, unknown. And you really have a black swan issue and all that rat's nest of software that's been written decades ago and is still functioning out there.
Great question. Val, do you have any thoughts to start with?
Well,
Especially
legacy.
Sandia's
Well,
mission, in terms of
yeah. I mean, and again, I think your point about legacy code is a good one. I mean, it's very expensive to, for that matter, more expensive to revamp the code than frequently the hardware. So typically it's not touched. And again, it kind of boils down to budgetary constraints as far as, again, in the ideal world, if you had infinite resources, you would try and address all the possible scenarios. But again, even for folks that we work with, I mean, they always say, well, we'd like to kind of know what your ROI is in terms of, again, if you're dealing with a trusted system, what should we look at across the board on our system that gives us the best, reassurance or resiliency, given the insertion costs. And because at the end of the day, I mean, there's a number of different circumstances where, including the trusted foundry, right? I mean, where there was a mandate that all government defense electronics go through that, and it was, yeah, exactly. It's exuberant in terms of the ability for folks to adopt that, because ASICs are very expensive. FPGAs are essentially what everybody prefers to use, right? And in that environment, they deal with red hard, platforms or triple mode redundancy platforms to afford more of this reliability again. Because at the end of the day, you're dealing with harsh radiation environments. You're looking at things that you can put into your system that inherently provides more resiliency against failure. But again, still, even in that circumstance, you could deal with a component issue where there's just a latent issue with capacitors. So,
One other thing that I would point out, And if I think about my experience working with NASA, they spend a lot of time on flight rules and flight rule change requests. One of the big problems with software that I remember my coding days and don't want to go back, but what is it that coders really don't like to do? Document. What is it that coders really need to do? Document. What do case tools need to do even better is document and version manage and self-updating archives of here's the config we're in now and here's how we got there and what is the human interpretable documentation and interpretation of our software state. And to the extent that that documentation is not available, it becomes increasingly difficult to even do state identification. So we've got to be able to identify it, we've got to be able to archive it, we've got to have human interpretable libraries of where we are right now.
I apologize if you talked about this, but have you considered defenses against the Independence Day attack? That notion that they're going to insert, some alien is going to insert JavaScript in your platform and cause you problems, right? But so that's kind of opening. Do you guys have a sense of how you could restrict software engineering for space platforms, such as a simple rule like no interpreted languages? It has to be compiled. So I cannot imagine that NASA could actually say you can't do this because it's so complicated. So many different groups, so many different software projects that have to come together to make a platform work. Do you have the ability to restrict languages, coding techniques, methodologies, and things like that? Or is that something that we all dream about?
Good luck with onboard recovery if you do that.
Oh, there's lots of issues to think about and consider, right? But you guys are in a position where you have an overarching mission that has some really great justifications for restrictions, okay? It's hard to say that in many, say in F-35 type platforms, you can say, I'm only gonna have this language in this platform because I only have these processors and these architectures. But you guys have a very hybrid architecture in space, especially if you're going to send something to Mars. You can end up with lots of different platforms, lots of different modules, lots of different languages, lots of different things. But could you guys come up with a method to restrict the software engineering techniques that are being used, say from a security perspective, no interpreted languages? Is that feasible, or is that just beyond the capability for the government to do? Is that a reasonable question? You guys are all kind of looking at each other. I just wonder if I'm asking the right question.
Yeah.
I think, I mean, for government missions, you can formulate a set of requirements, and that's what we have. And for example, I mean,
That's
I
right.
mentioned the
Yep.
harsh kind of radiation requirement. That puts requirements on, okay, well, what kind of hardware do you actually fly? Can it survive that? In that sense, you also have software requirements. One of the strictest requirements is kind of computation power and speed. And many of the speed requirements lead you to the interpreted languages as they're just faster in that sense. So I don't think it's impossible to make a mission requirement there. I don't think we can have control about the commercial missions.
That's difficult. Exactly, because I was going to say frequently we'll carry government payloads on commercial systems, and despite our box being secure and all efforts, I mean, if the rocket blows up, again, you're only as strong as your weakest link. So the issue is there's multiple players in the whole space business, right? Payload providers to the carrier, and not everybody necessarily has the same requirements. So there's kind of a black box. I mean, unless it's, again, it's a critical system that the customer requirements across the board, that's likely. But again, I think getting everybody on board and, again, dealing, as we talked about, cost-effective launches, those are challenges.
Yeah, I think you probably know this too, actually, from talking earlier, that there's contracts, obviously, for different government contracts where they'll dictate the languages that you can and can't use, for sure. but viewing it more from, I think you're saying more from a higher policy type of approach in terms of everyone having to do that, and maybe trying to, I guess in my mind, I'm trying to think what that would look like, and maybe coming up with categories of different types of software, and then limiting those different types of software possibly to certain particular languages, especially the kind of functionalities that are required for security critical type things and stuff like that. I would expect that would be doable for sure in my mind, but again, it would go back to those first two steps of understanding what is your strategy and so on and so forth, and really defining what is it you're saying you're accomplishing by that, right? Because if you don't say what it is you're trying to accomplish with it and so on and so forth, it's hard to tell what.
But it can be simple things like only IPv6 on the platform, so no IPv4 from the internet could ever get onto the platform. You know, those kinds of restrictions actually are very protective and very architecturally restrictive, which gives you some control, right? Mm-hmm. No Windows software on the platform. No Windows 98. You can't get rid of that, right?
Well, it's easier to restrict old. I'm sorry, I didn't code. It's easier to restrict old stuff off, but dictating new stuff that ends up being old stuff is the problem.
Well, a long time ago, it was thought that ATM was going to solve a lot of these problems, because if ATM was the only thing running on these devices, nobody could get in, right? Because there's no bridge. Mm-hmm. But so these ideas of building real protective platforms that are incompatible with external infrastructure, that can't use any of the same binaries, they're in the same interpret language types, work. You know, but they're difficult because it costs more money and all that kind of stuff. I'm just interested in your opinion.
One of the big problems, though, is the testing and advanced development you need to develop will always put you in a launch state that is several years behind what is going to be state of the art. And so you're always going to have a heterogeneous architecture. And the launched architecture may be the oldest one there. So it's kind of hard to say, keep the rest of your platform in, the relative Stone Age.
Yeah, and I think the timing issue is critical, that we say, okay, my experience with government regulations on kind of technology is, as it has to go through the legislative process, it's kind of, when it comes into effect, it's kind of outdated at that point. So I would rather argue against it, because I think in many cases the intention is good, but it's actually holding us back.
Fortran is the answer. Okay.
Yeah, I was going to say something about Fortran. Thanks.
So, please, sir.
Sure. Quick philosophical question. How are you going to manage the conflict between the architectural perspective of engineers and programmers? Let me illustrate that. After a series of satellite failures, in 2002, the GAO published a report indicating two classes of threats to satellites. Class 1 were unintentional acts, which included solar, wind, meteorites. And Class 2 were intentional acts, like somebody trying to knock down a transmission tower. What they ignored were bad software architectural decisions and poor coding practices, both of which have caused problems with satellites. System Socrates said two satellites were going to pass within 564 meters. The actual value was 0. The collision in 2009 created 2,000 pieces of debris. When you hear a number like 564, you would think there's a precision of plus or minus half a meter. They were off by 564. The architectural decision I'm thinking of is that 10-bit weak counter, which rolled over on Saturday, and it turns out that some 777s actually had some problems with the date as a result of that rollover. It's an architectural thing. These are neither intentional nor unintentional threats, and I'm thinking that the people who did the GA report came from an engineering mindset, not a programming mindset, and I believe that would seriously jeopardize any long-term space mission. I'd like your thoughts.
Very brief thoughts from the panel.
Hardware, software vulnerability is vulnerability.
I think that is a problem, but I think as universities, we try to say, okay, how can we make a more connected schedule to, find a common language.
Yeah, I mean, trusted supply chain, right? I mean, that's a given for any type of government furnished equipment. You always worry about that. And It's part of the reason why there are captive fabs, because again, with offshore suppliers, you aren't certain about the pedigree. So
Yeah, I know within our industry, there's definitely things in place to, obviously not just verification, but software assurance and things like that. A lot of things that are worked to try to deal with those kind of things. And it's kind of neat that now, even though I'm a pretty young guy as far as I'm concerned, they didn't have cybersecurity. I tell my kids that I sound like an old guy, but cybersecurity and all these things weren't a thing, or software assurance wasn't even a thing. But all the universities have it now, right? And hopefully it only grows, right? So most of the people writing the code still didn't grow up with any of that stuff either. So in my mind, I'm hoping that through schools, through the colleges like Purdue and so on, that this kind of the practices that lend themselves to avoiding those kind of things will improve. I mean, you have to admit, it's pretty amazing that they got it exactly to 0, though. I mean, it's pretty impressive. You couldn't do that twice.
Absolutely.